This is on. Fabulous. Okay. Thank you so much for that introduction, Laura, and it's wonderful to be here with you all today. Like three things, two hands. So, for as long as whatever. There we go. For as long as the modern concept of transness has been around, the bodies denoted by the term have tended to be those that seek or have experienced medical intervention to correct that body toward a different configuration of gender expression and secondary sexual characteristics. In part because of this, well into the 21st century, both medical practitioners providing gender-affirming surgery and trans people themselves understood transness as a journey along a choreographed route of steps, from identification to psychotherapy to hormones to surgery. And I forgot to do this because I did it earlier, but just in case, I am still a white person. I am still wearing a navy blue suit, and my pronouns remain they, them for this foreseeable future. Statt auf Deutsch, wenn ich nutze. As trans studies scholars have extensively documented, the relationship between trans bodies and medical science is at best fraught. Moreover, to understand transness as calling for or traveling along a trajectory toward correction or being able to be fixed by science reifies an understanding of gender as binary that only rarely maps well onto the lived experience of trans subjects, who, in recent years, increasingly challenge notions of binary gender and of physical transition as a cure or endpoint. These ways of being trans echo narratives of being disabled, a category that also has an at-best fraught relationship with the biomedical fields. I'm trying to include our friends over here, so I'm just gonna keep swiveling. Like trans bodies, disabled bodies are extensively visually documented by medical science to ever more specifically taxonomize deviance from a norm, a process that tacitly shores up the lie that such a thing as a norm even exists. Perhaps consequently, the fields of disability studies and trans studies both endeavor to think beyond a linear arc that culminates in a normative body, such as from injury, illness, or lack, through exploration and procedures to healthfulness or cure. Trans studies and disability studies also think about moments in which one is precluded from pursuing or chooses to opt out of a traditionally linear existence, not as discrete events from which one recovers or returns, but instead as an ongoing process of survival, one that may overlap with, but is not contingent on, medical intervention. As Alice, Michael, and what I've learned to just call the research group have already noted today in their wonderful remarks, there are also critical practices in both fields that encourage slowness and noticing on nonlinear timescales that rhyme with the object-based analysis at the center of art history. At the juncture of these three fields, then, exists a range of projects that seek to reclaim visual narratives of medicalized bodies by figuring them in ways that evade the terms of categorization so often used to justify experimentation on and the marginalization of them. Such projects are the subject of our talk today.
Hi everyone, my name's Mae. I use they, them pronouns. I'm a white person wearing glasses, a like leather pokey blazer, and my hair is in two braids. So in a 1992 performance titled Visiting Hours, the artist Bob Flanagan lay in a hospital bed in a room mocked up like a hospital room, surrounded by medical equipment, a video montage of bondage scenes, spliced with daytime cartoons, and a routine chest x-ray of Flanagan in which his lungs containing a buildup of mucus from cystic fibrosis were framed by two captive ball nipple piercings. The room was installed in a larger gallery set up with childlike play scenes interspersed with mementos mori, and visitors could come and go, exploring the larger gallery or entering the smaller space to dialogue with Bob himself. Periodically and without any warning to visitors, Flanagan would be hoisted out of the bed by a hidden pulley system bound to its ankles and operated by his collaborator, partner, and dominatrix, Cherie Rose, revealing a frail-looking nude form that dangled upside down several feet above the bed for an uncomfortable-looking amount of time. Visiting Hours explores how sickness and disability challenge key binaries of normative living, such as life and death, adulthood and childhood, control and its loss. Its central focal point, Flanagan's bed and hoist, do a particularly acute form of conceptual labor toward challenging normative visual regimes of the disabled body. And it does this, crucially, in relation to the bed, that central focal point not only of many disabled lives that agglomerate to what disability scholars call bed life, which, as Kahn, Malik, and Rhodes put, conveys part of the ways that we take up the bed as a means of continuing life in often recognizable modes and schemes. Bed life offers a rejoinder to ableist assumptions that time spent in bed entails the stoppage of a life only for a period of time, in part by simply giving language to the fact that some lives are lived primarily or often in bed, more in than out of it. Visiting hours offers a window into a life in which conditions that attend prolonged periods of being in bed, and which entail pain, rest, and endurance, are arranged alongside pleasure and desire to interrupt standardized visualizations of the disabled body. Flanagan's bed life is active. His hoist places him in relationship to abjection, not just in relationship to disability, but also in the context of BDSM, to demonstrate that disability does not preclude explorations of sociality, sex, and desire. The cartoons, children's building blocks, and x-rays that surround him compound the effects of what might seem to the uninitiated to be contradictions in condition, giving pictorial form to the complex multivalences of ill lives. Like chronic illness, these objects reappear as a demarcation of the return to debilitation caused by disease and its accomplices. This lingering of the body in hospital, of illness in the body, of objects touched and deserted and touched again in the waiting room, is echoed in Flanagan's own lingering above the bed, his hanging in suspension upside down, and the ensuing dissociative rush of blood to the head is only given respite when he is returned to the horizontality of rest and discomfort that is the life of the bed. This performance then brings the bed life of chronic illness together with a hovering disassociation of care and desire, a desire to be better, a dependency on care, and the coextensive curve away from normative standards of desirability. Disability studies tends to begin from an assumption that the pursuit of health and biomedical sciences, which relies on a temporal arc from sickness to management or cure by way of treatment, is at odds with lived experiences of chronic illness and disability. The hoist and visiting hours, which might surprise not only the unsuspecting visitor, but also one who understands that the body being hoisted is experiencing a very developed stage of cystic fibrosis, also challenges the idea of rest and illness as passive states, and a presumption of fragility inherent to illness. Flanagan's suspension might also spur a desire in the viewer for a return to relief through Flanagan's return to the bed. But it does this in a space that is plastered with BDSM images and contains a BDSM-adjacent device, staging desire of any kind more broadly as a membrane across chronic illness, sex, care, and release cross, converge, and intermingle. Though visiting hours was made at the height of the historical AIDS crisis, when, as public data has since demonstrated, death from AIDS-related causes were at their highest in the first and hardest hit communities in the US, Flanagan makes no reference to this loss. Visiting hours then speaks to just one facet of the genealogy of fine art projects that investigate disability and desire. Another, which is crucial to more contemporary projects, emerges as the condition of POS, or HIV-positive, desiring body. Al-Qaeda is a 1995 photograph by Albert J. Wynn of the torso of a presumptively male subject performing a non-Sabbath day prayer by wrapping tefillin, something practiced by some of the more devout people of the Jewish faith, that is also reserved for men and meant to remind the observant of the support of God gave along the way of Exodus of Egypt. The title comes from another Hebrew biblical tale in which God commands Abraham to bind his son Isaac for sacrifice. Wrapping tefillin is, in part, a ritual to commemorate a series of acts of care, while Akedah is a story about giving up one thing you love for another, one of countless such culturally specific stories of fathers sacrificing sons, restaged during the AIDS crisis to stand in for social, familial, governmental, and even in-community ties not just broken but thrown down, out of homophobia disguised as fear or indifference during the AIDS crisis. And bringing them together here, Wynn draws out a set of tensions that trouble the easy delineation between the pleasure of being subject to someone else and the pain of the terms through which such things usually come about, In framing of the shot, that all that is visible is the wrapped arm, a draped leather strap, and modestly bandaged site of a recent biomedical intervention, whether it is from an HIV test, a routine blood exam for other reasons, or some kind of medical experiment on a desperate body is left ambiguous. Wynne situates these tensions directly in genealogies of BDSM and of the medicalized terms that structure paused, disabled, and other similarly subjected lives lived in, bed, or out, in which the contingencies of life are ever present as a condition of having to persistently undergo a treatment that at once staves off and reminds of death.
One of the primary inheritors of these two manifestations of disability and desire in late 20th century art in the US is Mae Howard, from whom you just heard. The Tetherings is a sculptural work by Howard that consists of 1.5 meter gauge medical tubing, barred and abraded to comprise a 4-meter object suspended from a steel hook that casts shadows on the floor that accentuate its dimensionality, while creating a 2-dimensional projection akin to a second work that is nevertheless only contingently visible and ever-changing. Ubiquitous in hospitals, medical tubing often signifies a rite of passage following gender-affirming surgeries such as top surgery, while often having no meaning or being staged as a further hindrance during similar procedures undergone to different ends, such as a double mastectomy, the name given to a procedurally similar surgery usually taken in the cancer context. Bilateral tubing also rarely drains identical, making obvious to the body draining or those caring for it how asymmetrical a single body really is. The tubes, like chronic disability and non-binary transness, gesture towards these multiple asymmetries of different names for different procedures, of similar procedures given different weights, of pre- and post-operation, and of 2- and 3-dimensionality, and of visibility and invisibility, of illness, queerness, transness, desire, and so on. What falls on one side or the other of these binaries, however, often changes depending on what flavor of marginality we're talking about. For example, in a trans context, desire is often implied, both in the traditional sense of sexual or sensual desire and its expression, and in a more conceptual way that relates to the widely variegated forms of desiring associated with different valences of transness. But whereas trans subjects are often imagined as hypersexual as a condition of their historical association with sexual minorities, the disabled body is not often thought in relation to desire or bodily autonomy. It is perhaps because of this that the disabled body is also often thought as mutually exclusive from gender nonconformity, as though the condition of illness precludes sexual appetite, gender identification, or the agency to express or satisfy a desire for either. This exposes an implicit hierarchy of disease and diagnosis, where a certain kind of deviation from a medical norm, chronic illness for example, precludes access to other forms of gender care or imaginaries of desire, as those which come visible through BDSM. These concepts come together in Howard's 2022 performance Immobility Appendage, in which they folded their body into a kneeling position on a prayer bench and then took 2 parallel columns of 13 back piercings by Mistress Sunmi Park. Each piercing was attached to the wall in front of them with a string, holding them both in suspension and down in place, and demanding they make near constant adjustments to their body to endure in ways that would have been barely perceptible to the audience. This armature and Howard's endurance in it heightened the sensations of pain Howard lives with every day as a result of chronic illness, and also triggered pleasure earned through the submission to pain. Simultaneously, the piercings, done at regular intervals, offer a consistent pacing to pain, enabling them to anticipate the time and level of pain to come, thereby giving them a sense of control over their affective experience not present in their daily experience of chronic pain, where pain is anticipated but cannot be timed or measured. The performance ended with the dominatrix asking the audience to leave the room while Howard was still pierced and strung into the suspension, thus arresting the work for the viewers in a moment without visual relief that harkened back to the spectatorial experience of Flanagan being suspended and visiting hours, and therefore situating this work firmly in a BDSM context. With immobility appendage, Howard creates a space to transpose the conditions in which their body experiences pain out of the procedures, probings, examinations, and countless medications required to keep them alive within the medical industrial complex. They also intentionally selected a chronically ill and gender nonconforming dominatrix to go with their trans body. This pleasure-power exchange in the context of bondage, domination, sadomasochism, BDSM relationships that traverse or transgress gendered and desiring lines affords measures of pleasures and relief not available in biomedical contexts. In both scenarios, Howard's body is read as a receiver of pain, but the terms of that sensation become radically different. BDSM rituals, which are fundamentally a form of care, also afford a catharsis of relief not available to many from care and medical contexts. Immobility appendage, therefore, contributes to a visual vocabulary that links chronic illness, desire, and BDSM with non-normative expressions of gender, contravening hierarchies of sickness and showing it to be possible to be trans and disabled and desiring all at once. In searching at the edge of the body and its fabricated seams for a metronome of controlled pain to manage that which one has comparatively less control over, time itself becomes suspended. This very disability-oriented experience has a correlate in the experience of non-normative gender and sexuality. In seeking out new forms for which one may have no previous referent, one often finds oneself lost in the time of thought, temporarily suspended in a process of searching for ways of understanding a somatic experience without an easily identifiable correlate, a medical or social roadmap. Mae and I are also working between and among methodological roadmaps. The nature of the work that we both do is rooted in a baseline assumption that disciplines tend to be bad at interrogating their own shortcomings. But feminist, crip, and trans methods we are using, in addition to the Black, queer, transnational forms of thinking with which we are regularly in conversation, are methods that derive from lived experiences of subjugation and violence that are products of interdisciplinary analysis, and that produce particularly good methods for identifying and challenging historical assumptions that have baked blind spots into disciplines. A crucial example of this is disciplines that turn on claims to objectivity, which for us as practitioners is a presumptive fallacy. Claims to objectivity have, for example, in science, long obscured the degree to which certain things we think we know about absolutes are actually fabricated out of other projects that had particular agendas. Londa Schiebinger has shown how the science propping up gender roles was a long-term project begun in the Enlightenment period, motivated by a desire to prove the female sex as lesser than. Gabriel Rosenberg, who was recently a fellow at Max Planck, where we met the research group, has shown the science of sex as we know it today to be shaped by agricultural developments. Beans Velosi has demonstrated how our binaries themselves are a product of the experiments meant to reify eugenicist efforts to prove the superiority of white bodies, prove there in scare quotes, of course. And Banu Subramaniam has shown how such things come from and circumscribe similar efforts in the plant and animal worlds. But a trans and disability studies analysis brought together with art enables us to engage a selection of objects not explicable solely through the close reading of art historical analysis. To fully see them, we need to understand how trans and disabled bodies come into being, become visible, and do so in ways that may or may not be legible under normative spectatorial regimes. Thank you very much.